Acts chapter 7 verse 54, I want us to look at something here. When they heard these things, they were cut to the heart, and they gnashed at him with their teeth. Then they cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, and ran at him with one accord. And they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. I want us to focus on this character Saul. He's not necessarily participating in the stoning, but he is complicit in the stoning in that he stands there and they're laying their coats at his feet. What does that mean? Well, obviously, if any of you guys have thrown anything in your life, you've thrown a ball or skipped rocks off of a lake, if you're wearing a robe or a jacket, it heavily constricts your ability to get some torque. So what you do is you take all your stuff off before you throw. And what Saul was essentially doing was he was saying, hey, this guy Stephen's got to go. Let me help you. So Saul was very much complicit in the stoning of Stephen. It says, now Saul was consenting to his death. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made a great lamentation over him. Verse 3, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. I am laying the case that this guy Saul was not a good guy. And if you were a Christian and you saw this guy, you would run the opposite direction because his whole goal was to destroy you. Acts chapter 9 verse 1, it says, then Saul, still breathing threats and what? Murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, do you see how he has increasingly gotten more violent? From holding the jackets, to dragging men and women out of their homes, to now breathing threats of slaughter. This guy Saul was not a good guy. Now, here's the interesting thing about God. Something happens to Saul. He's going to Damascus, and on the way there, Jesus himself appears to him in a bright light. And Jesus says, Saul, what are you doing? Why are you persecuting me? Is it hard to kick against the goads? And the Bible says that Saul fell off and he was blinded and he couldn't see. He said, Saul, I want you to go into Damascus. Ananias goes. He sees Saul. He lays hands on Saul. The Bible says something as scales fell off of Saul's eyes. He could see. He's changed. The disciples are shocked, like, whoa, is this the same Saul? When he gets to Jerusalem, he has a very interesting reception. Verse 26. Now when Saul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and did not believe that he was a disciple. And the reason they didn't believe that he was a disciple is because Saul was a bad guy previously. Such to the point that his reputation preceded him. Every time he walked into a city, people flinched. I make the case to show you that because I want to juxtapose that fact with a very interesting statement that Saul himself makes later in life. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 3, but with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I know of nothing against myself. Saul makes a statement that when it comes time to my conscience and my heart, I don't know of anything that I've done wrong. Can we rewind a minute? Bro, we were there when you stoned Stephen. We saw it. Bro, we were there when you were breathing slaughters and threats, dragging people out of their houses, men and women. And now you stand and you say, I know of nothing against myself. How on earth can you make that claim? Because he understood where his righteousness stemmed from. Once you know who you are, and once you know what Jesus has done and what his blood has provided, you no longer walk around with this complex of, am I righteous? Am I not? You know what the Bible says that God does? He says he takes our transgressions and he throws them into the sea of forgetfulness. And Paul, reading the scriptures and knowing the scriptures, said, if God himself doesn't remember my wrongs, guess what? I don't know of anything against myself. There are people on this earth who will know things that you've done in your past, and in their minds, they will never forgive you. They will never allow you to live it down. But aren't you glad that your righteousness is not based on what they say or what they think? Your righteousness is based on what God says and what Jesus has done, the finished work on Calvary. Paul reiterates this in the book of Romans chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God. Verse 5. Through him we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations for his name. God says you have received grace for obedience. In order to fulfill obedience, you need grace. Why do you need grace? Because you're not going to do it right every time. But God says, I understand that, and I remember that you're but dust. So what I've done is I've provided grace so that you can walk in obedience. I provided the grace there. And who understood that better than Paul? The aiding and abettor of murder. There is grace for us